When discussing Jak and Daxter, people fondly remember the series that Naughty Dog did on PS2, but of course those weren't the only Jak games. First was Daxter, which we discussed last week, and now we're here to discuss the final game in the Jak series, Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier, which released all the way back in 2009 on the PlayStation Portable and PlayStation 2. A game that, you may be surprised to hear, was originally being developed by Naughty Dog. The story goes that after working on Jak X, it was time for the team to fully get in gear for the new franchise on PS3, a full action-adventure title starring a real-life human, which ended up being Uncharted: Drake's Fortune. But it turns out that Naughty Dog was also looking to develop for the PlayStation Portable. I mean, it's a new Sony device, we're a Sony team, we haven't tackled handheld games yet, might as well give it a shot, and so they began developing the next Jak game for the PSP. But the problems arose with this approach because the PS3 was an infamously tough system to develop for, and in addition to that you had the natural challenges that arose at the start of the 7th gen with games going full HD. Well, HD at the time. 720p is nothing to write home about now, but you know what I mean. Developing Uncharted was such a demanding task for ND that their PSP team working on a Jak game had to be shelved to get all hands on deck to make sure they properly understood the PS3 hardware to use it to max efficiency like the studio had done for the PS1 and the PS2, and then ship the product when all was said and done. Not to get too in-depth on Uncharted's history, as this isn't the Uncharted video, but I'm bringing it up because it concerns what became of Jak PSP. This is where the studio High Impact Games comes in. This was a team that was formed in the 2000s by people who once had worked at Insomniac Games and Naughty Dog in the PS2 days. Their first release was on the PSP in 2007, Ratchet & Clank Size Matters, something the team was naturally cut out for given their history at Insomniac. Size Matters proved to be a massive success on PSP, and 1 year later they released another Ratchet PSP spin-off, Secret Agent Clank. To this day, Ratchet fans still remember these games fondly. I covered them last summer after I did the PS2 games in that series, if you were curious. But to put it lightly, I think both games are absolutely abysmal when going back to them. The former being a game that could have been good with some simple changes to how it was balanced, but the game we got quickly becomes a frustrating affair with weak weapons and overpowered enemies. The latter game is just one of the worst I've ever played. A game that just boggles the mind with its weak writing, frustrating and boring levels, and an onslaught of minigames, and just everything I don't like in a game. But the positive reception they got on their Ratchet PSP titles would make them prime candidates to take over where Naughty Dog left off on Jak PSP. And hey, Naughty Dog starting development might mean good things, right? Well, not really. Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier is a game that fans were dissatisfied with from day one, for many reasons that we'll get into before the next half hour or so is up. Yeah, no hot take this week. The Lost Frontier is not a good game, and it's easily the worst Jak and Daxter game. One I was pretty excited for when it was released. I mean, it's another Jak game, but a proper platforming sequel. We hadn't had one in 5 years at this point. It was one of my 3 most anticipated games of the year. But of course, one of them was a children's tie-in game, one was a lame-as-all-get-out Jak game, and the other was Batman Arkham Asylum. That one's an all-time classic, but that is of course a story for another day. Back on target, I want to say I'm not trying to make a hit job on the people who make these games. I'm just stating my opinion, since I like talking about every game in my favorite franchises. So when I revisit these PSP spin-offs that I played a lot as a kid, some part of me hopes that this playthrough might change things and I can see it in a new light. But in the case of these 3 games, it actually ends up coming out worse than it did before. So what's not to like about Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier? Well, the game begins with Jak, Daxter, and someone who, sources say, is Kira traveling to the edge of the world because the world is running out of eco and they're seeking out more of it to save the world. Without it, the planet is seeing eco storms raging almost constantly. They get ambushed by sky pirates and the scuffle causes them to crash land at the brink, the edge of the world, because apparently the precursors never finished making this planet and so they just had to cut it off at this point. While none of what I just said made any sense, you get back in the air and aid the European people in their battle against the Sky Pirates, making a truce with them for the time being, getting us into the Lost Frontier. As I said, before the first cutscene is over, I have several questions, but I'll just stick to the gameplay for now. The early game had me doubting my memories of this game, because when looking at the game's structure and pacing, I should be singing its praises. I mean, you get a full platforming tutorial level, an intro to how sky combat works, a shooting tutorial with more platforming, another plane mission, and then a big level with platforming, new powers, combat, and the works. I thought Jak 3's opening act was really poorly paced since it bombarded players with minigame after minigame after minigame, not giving you a proper platforming mission until an hour into the game. The Lost Frontier is actually much more consistent at first, dogfighting mission followed by a massive platforming stage. Structure that could totally work, but I obviously don't think it works, and that's because Jak's movement is very stiff. Jak felt great to control in the PS2 trilogy because of how seamlessly you could go from his standard running to rolling and jumping out of a roll, his uppercut and dive being extensions of your moveset as well. That synergy between Jak's actions is just not in The Lost Frontier, so now movement just feels slow. The game just doesn't have the physics of previous games, making the platforming far more by the books as you jump from one to the next. His attacks can't be seamlessly integrated into your movement, so instead, you wait several seconds to rebound from the ground pound, for example. It looks and technically plays like Jak, it just doesn't feel like Jak, making all the regular gameplay a chore. No greater example than combat. This also feels pretty limp as your basic punches and spins technically do damage, but the enemies barely react to it, and since you're pretty committed to almost every attack you do, enemies ganging up on you is pretty common. Even the uppercut, which should allow you to get some room from enemies, doesn't do nearly as good a job as it did in previous games because again, the enemies don't really react to it. With guns, it's the same problem. The scattergun does not put distance between you and your enemies like it did in Jak 2 and Jak 3, and the Vulcan Fury does not stun enemies, making it still quite easy to be torn to shreds when enemies get too close. The most effective weapon is the blaster, as the spin kick combo is more useful than ever as you can get enemies locked in a loop until they die. The Peacemaker isn't in this game, instead you get a basic grenade launcher called the Lobber, which isn't as cool to be sure, but I think it's effective for what it is. Now in terms of combat, I really don't know why it was as limp feeling as it was in this game. Similar to the Ratchet & Clank games that were made by High Impact Games, making weapons do good damage, making your attacks pack a punch, and having proper balance isn't really a hardware issue, it's a design issue. Now, The Lost Frontier doesn't have the damage problem those Ratchet games did, but why does the scattergun not put distance between you and the enemies? Why does the uppercut not launch enemies into the air, especially the small ones? These are tinier things that really add up. Now, in regards to how Jak plays, that much I can give some leniency on. Quite frankly, I don't think the PSP was capable of doing Jak's gameplay a lot of justice. Now, I'm sure if Naughty Dog had developed it, it would be based on the code from the PS2 games, so it would have felt a little better in combat, but I'm referring to the controls. If you play a lot of PSP games based on PS2 franchises, you'll quickly see how held back the games were by the PSP not having a second analog stick. In a 3D action game, you have to be able to control the camera, so PSP games all had to come up with their own idea as to how they would go about it. Some games, like Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops, used the D-pad as a camera, and other games used L and R to turn the camera left and right, The Lost Frontier being one of those games. But in Jak 2, shooting was on R1, with the camera naturally being on the second stick. The PSP didn't have L2 or R2 nor a second stick, so yeah, the game has the camera on the shoulder buttons, but that means shooting had to be on triangle, the only button left in the controller to use. It just feels even more awkward to play as a result of that. The Ratchet games barely got away with the limited control scheme since you already used circle to shoot in Ratchets 1 and 2 on PS2, and with the strafing mechanic being automatic, circling around enemies is no problem. Hitting L and R at once in size matters also allowed you to long jump, which was cumbersome but doable. Here, rolling just wouldn't work with the camera and the button layout, so it was axed. And after finishing that sentence, I gotta say, it feels really weird to use Ratchet & Clank Size Matters and Secret Agent fucking Clank as a positive example. But here we are. In this game, without those mechanics, the gameplay just feels clunky and lame, and there wasn't much they could have done about it while trying to be faithful to the mechanics of Jak while also dealing with this console. Although I am going to mention the most bizarre bug I've seen in a game in a hot minute. Sometimes when turning the camera, the entire game speed would slow down to like 50 or 60% speed. I'm not joking, just watch. This would happen frequently, and the only way to stop it was by dying. Has anyone ever seen that before? I never have. Although this was actually my first time playing The Lost Frontier on PSP. Well, the PSP version on the Vita TV, but still. I mentioned before that this game got a PS2 port developed in-house at High Impact, like the Size Matters port. I wasn't sure what the Jak fan consensus was and which version of the two was better. Ratchet fans are very confident in the PS2 version having butchered this classic game, but my comments show that some Jak fans still do believe that the PSP version of The Lost Frontier is superior as a game. Now that I've played all three of these games on PS2 and PSP, I'm gonna say that I am sick of this absolute hoax. On PS2, The Lost Frontier has better controls because the second analog stick is used for the camera, which in some segments is extended to be a full 360 degrees. Shooting is on R1, the eco powers are all D-pad combos, the resolution is doubled to 480p, and that's that. The PSP version has better lighting, more colorful environments, and more stable performance because my god, The Lost Frontier on PS2 runs like ass with frequent slowdown and ghosting effects. But the better controls is the deciding factor in my opinion. Better overall performance does make sense if that's someone's reason for preferring the game on PSP, but I have never seen someone bring it up, nor have I ever seen this camera rotation slowdown issue that was exclusive to the PSP version ever get brought up either. To this day, 14 years after Size Matters hit the PS2, and 13 years after Agent Clank and The Lost Frontier did, I have no idea where the high-impact hoax, as I'm gonna call it, came from. Best I can tell, the games all reviewed worse on PS2, but that's because if you play them as PSP games, it's more impressive, right? But I'm not even looking at it from that lens. The PSP was a powerful system in its day and had many technologically impressive games released on it, but it's still possible for the game to be good, which is the thing I'm judging it by. Sure, Daxter or Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops wouldn't be as fun on a console compared to the actual console games, but if a game is fun, then it's fun. These three are just not that, even with the enhancements brought to them on PS2. So to quote Baron Praxis,
"Pay no attention to this foolish hoax. The games are just as good on PS2 as they were on PSP. Maybe even better."
Maybe that wasn't an exact quote, but anyway. Because I think the combat and platforming is fundamentally not fun, it makes it so that all the new additions that are nice go in one ear and out the other, such as getting eco power-ups again. Red eco allows you to create explosions, yellow eco gives you the ability to propel yourself in the air, you can activate a shield and create crystals with green eco. Don't know why the life energy eco would do that, but still. And with blue eco you can teleport yourself and slow down time. Some segments even requiring you to use these powers in tandem, like teleporting across a pool of dark eco while also needing the shield raised. Things like that are a good way of scaling the difficulty and using all your abilities. I also like being able to use Dark Eco as currency to get upgrades to colored Eco abilities, like energy attacks in the yellow category or health upgrades in the green. But like I said, I fundamentally think this game isn't good, so rare moments of design I think are satisfying don't really leave an impact in the grand scheme of things. Although I should take this moment to issue a correction from the Jak 2 video. In it, I stated that Jak lost all his Eco powers in the experiment, but that's not true. That's the reason he even survives the Dark Warrior program to begin with. The Dark Eco just causes him to lose precursor interactivity. That's all. I just had a misread of this line here from Metalcore at the end of Jak 2.
Now that you've been altered with Dark Eco, the stone will never open for you. Your younger self, however, still has the pure gift.
For years, that misread caused me to think this game was breaking canon by giving Jak Eco powers again, but I was wrong. So you get off the hook for that one, game. But still, the game is overall more frustrating than anything else. Like when an enemy is clearly on radar but didn't spawn in, so I had to stand around waiting for the time to run out so I could do the segment again. Or the numerous camera angles that don't give me a good view, causing my demise, or when I can barely put any distance between me and this mutant mini-boss, giving it the ability to kill me in 2.75 nanoseconds. How about this part where you control Daxter in a shield, but he's flailing all over the place and I can barely steer him, once more leading to my doom several times over. But when The Lost Frontier isn't annoying me, it's just incredibly boring. The two major game elements are the platforming and the dogfighting combat. I think having aerial battles was a good idea for a Jak game. The series had explored almost every other way of competing with vehicles, so this was a natural next step. I think the planes you unlock all have good handling, like you pull down on the stick to pull up and vice versa, as the plane takes a second to actually do it, which doesn't sound good, but it feels like you're controlling a heavy plane, which I like. Even on PSP, the controls work well. The D-pad doing evasive maneuvers like turning around and the barrel roll.
Actually, it's called an aileron.
Shut up, commenter, no one cares. Like the cars in Jak X, the planes in The Lost Frontier have a decent bit of customization. Not in terms of appearance, but destroyed planes drop scrap metal that you can use to buy new weapons and upgrade the ones you have, mixing and matching to make each plane to your liking. However, here is where the problems begin. A little gimmick mode like this can be just fine as a way of breaking up the regular gameplay, but similar to the PSP Ratchet games, they make it overstay its welcome by quite a large chunk of time. I'm mainly thinking about this phase towards the end of the game where you have to defend the Sky Pirate base from these turret towers, and this goes on for no lie, 20 minutes. Because you have to destroy all 3 towers and then control a missile into the core of one of them, and if you die, you have to do it all over again. But then you have to destroy the turrets on the other 2 again and control another missile, and then a 3rd time and a 3rd missile for the last tower. There are checkpoints here, but why does it have to go on for so long? The mechanics of these planes aren't so great that it warrants playing for a half hour. But as if that wasn't bad enough, the next thing you do is fly through a vortex, and this goes on for 5 minutes as well. Only I died at the end and had to do the whole thing again. Once that was done, I was in another dogfight against the Europans, which took me over 20 minutes yet again. An entire hour of this dogfighting, which should go without saying, is quite overkill. But here's the most sinister part. During the mission with the turrets, I was told by the game that if I wanted to change my weapons, I could hit restart and was allowed that chance. I almost took the game up on that offer, but realized, no, I'm sure they'd have it go all the way back to the start with 3 towers standing, but if I kept trying with my current loadout, I would eventually win. Which I did. But then this massive battle with the Europans began, and I was getting destroyed and needed a different weapon, so I did try it, and what do you know, checkpoints be damned, all progress must be restarted on this mission. That's real nice. The whole game just feels unfinished, and it seems that it was. One of the designers at High Impact got interviewed by a Jak fan via email a few years back, and the interview was hosted on the Jak Wiki. He mentioned that the game had the shortest dev cycle of the 3 games they did for Jak and Ratchet, which kind of surprised me given the fact that it was only released a year and a half after Secret Agent Clank, which came out only 1 year after Size Matters, but maybe it was easier to do that game since the Ratchet gameplay was already programmed, and with Jak they had to start from scratch. And also, maybe they didn't get that full time to work on The Lost Frontier. Who knows? Either way, it's pretty clear to all parties involved that The Lost Frontier just didn't get the time in the oven needed to really do good in its ideas, which is why it feels padded out and clunky more than anything else. By the end of The Lost Frontier, I'm just left begging for the game to end. I don't want to play these levels, and I dread the dogfighting that awaits me afterwards. Case in point, the last main levels in the game, where I get these terrible camera angles that make it difficult to tell where I'm jumping, combat that's wonky and obnoxious against enemies and bosses, and then a massive dogfighting sequence to end the game where you first chase the main villain down for several minutes, only to then battle his ship for several minutes, watching the same animation of the shield going down 3 times to begin and end each phase. It's so boring. I'm just flying forward, blasting targets by mashing the shoot button. As I stated, you're just begging for the game to end. And of course, the terrible story isn't helping. It turns out that a lot of these conceptual ideas like Sky Pirates, the Eco Storms, and the Brink were all there when Naughty Dog was developing this game, but that doesn't change the fact that I think many of these concepts of the game don't make any sense. The precursors didn't finish building the world? Like, what does that mean? They literally hang out in the core of the planet, why not? What were they doing down there, if not finishing the planet they made? I don't know how you can run out of eco in the first place when, as established, eco is literally what all life in the universe of Jak comes from. Maybe that could be explained via people using too many resources that drain the world's eco, but with it just being stated that eco is running out, it just makes me wonder how that's even possible. It's good that the plot has a small number of characters in it, don't want the bloated cast of cameos that Jak 3 had, but still, I think it would have been nice for it to be established in the backstory this was like a mission from Samos or Torn or whoever, to make it feel like we're still in the Jak world. Because as it stands, it just doesn't with this different setting, different characters, and a completely different Jak. Jak is portrayed by Josh Keaton in this game, who's a great actor and does a good job with the material, but man, Mike Irwin was Jak, and seeing him not in the game stings as a longtime fan. Especially since the beta cutscenes from Naughty Dog's version of the game leaked on the internet before the game came out, and Mike Irwin was in it to do the lines they needed. And the cutscene direction is a lot more like the previous games, the characters look more on model, and the lines are funnier. So, why Jak was recast remains a mystery to this day. Same for why Kira was recast in Jak 3 for that matter. Anyway, the story also introduces this random-ass element where Daxter gets touched by Dark Eco and turns into a monster called Jak Daxter. I'm sure you were wondering why this hadn't been mentioned thus far, and it's because genuinely I always forget this is in the game. Whenever I get to this intro cutscene for this, I sigh as I remember you have to play boring minigames where you bash enemies and obstacles, solving switch puzzles in an overhead view for like 6 minutes straight at a time. It's pretty bad. There's nothing going on here. It's the same brain rot as the other game modes, but without the good stuff. But the thing is, even while playing the game, I forget this is in the game. No joke, when the cutscene for the second and third Dark Dax levels started, I was like, oh yeah, that's something I've got to do. Great. It's that forgettable. It doesn't even make sense anyway. Daxter's an Otzel, a precursor. Precursors touched by Dark Eco are Dark Makers, as seen in Jak 3. This one was a high-impact original. Besides all that, the story is just so boring and lame in this. Kira gets captured by the Sky Pirate Captain, Phoenix, but they're actually good guys and the Europans are really evil, experimenting on people with Dark Eco like Praxis did, and we get these story beats like a love triangle, a shocking betrayal of one of Phoenix's pirates, a gradual truce and friendship with Jak and Phoenix. It's just all so one note and predictable, in one ear and out the other. Although I noticed something. Phoenix never introduced himself in the opening cutscene, but when Kira is captured, Jak somehow knows his name when nobody told him it.
I've got Phoenix's ship on the scope. He's not gonna get away that easy.
But then when Kira knows his name, Jak is shocked.
Phoenix, don't.
Phoenix? What, you're on a first name basis now?
As I was saying, it all comes together in this lengthy scene where Phoenix sacrifices himself for the greater good and the day is saved and more adventures are coming, and I don't care. Thank goodness the game is over. That's all I'm left thinking at this point in the game. I revisit games I used to complain about in a curious sense. Maybe something will be different this time after all the time that's passed. But in the case of Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier, it's everything you've heard at this point. It's an easy E tier from me. When it's not frustrating, it's boring. When it's not boring, it's just a stale imitation of the Jak trilogy. For PSP standards, it's just not that good, considering that other imitations of PS2 games fared a lot better than this. And honestly, I'm not sure how this ranks in the high-impact hierarchy, if that's what you want to call it. This is the one people dislike the most of the three, and I must say, the game combined the frustration of Size Matters with the boredom of Agent Clank. Not to say Agent Clank wasn't frustrating, but that's not the biggest takeaway with the game. That is grounds for me to say it's the worst of the three, although this game isn't quite as soul-devouring to play as Agent Clank was. Sounds weird, but you just gotta play that game to know what I'm talking about. So there's that. I do think I'd replay Size Matters before this, though. Not that that's saying much, because I wouldn't want to play that game either. I really don't have that much else to add on this one. It's not good, and I don't think I'll ever play it again, seeing as I never even thought about touching it once between my original review from 6.5 years ago to now. But it is a shame that the Jak series went out with this quite weak note. To this day, Jak and Daxter have been seen in various crossover games and cameos, but this was indeed the last game in the series. But we currently live in a pop culture landscape heavily influenced by nostalgia. With PS2 games all turning 20 years old now, I think it's entirely possible, if not likely, that Jak and Daxter will make a return. Now, what I want them to do with it is a completely different question. Jak is such a unique mixture of different mechanics that I don't know if it would translate as well to the modern day as Ratchet & Clank gameplay does. But maybe that's a chance to do something much different with Jak and Daxter. Honestly, I have no idea what they would do with it now, but I'd be curious to see it either way. Personally, I'm pretty happy with the Jak series the way it is. By that I mean, every couple of years I'll go back to play Jaks 1 through X and be happy with the experience as is, remembering the games for what they were and having a good time. Not being sad the series is gone, but glad it happened at all, to the point where if it never came back, I'd be content with the games we got. A lot of people in the PlayStation platformer community, and I'm talking about people who are so deep in that the only franchises they like are these 5, they seem to have a serious resentment and hatred towards new games and the new franchises these PS2 platformer companies did after these franchises that sold a lot better. I don't hate Uncharted, The Last of Us, Infamous, or Ghost of Tsushima, especially those new Sucker Punch games that barely even played the former and never played the latter. And having played the Naughty Dog games, I love Uncharted, and I think The Last of Us is one of the best games of all time. But my point is, I've seen a lot of people resent these franchises for taking away our precious PlayStation platformers that really were never that popular to begin with, especially Sly Cooper. I just enjoy those newer games for what they are, and I'm really happy to see these companies that made my childhood favorites continue to be successful to this day doing the games they want to do, breaking boundaries in the industry they never could have dreamed up on PlayStation 2. So yeah, I don't need to see Jak come back. If it does happen, I'd be happy. Would love to see the Demolition Duo one last time, but if it doesn't, I'd be content. And generally, I think people in online discourse need to consume nostalgia in a healthier manner, but that's neither here nor there. I don't need a soapbox about that today, considering I could make a good video on that in the future. But having said all that, I'm glad that I got to go back one more time and give Jak and Daxter the definitive retrospective it deserved, as I think these are some of my best works, which is what I said about my Ratchet videos last summer that I think are nowhere near as good as these Jak videos. So I'd say my work's only improving much more each year and is only going up from here. But that pretty much covers it for this video, so next up, we got some of those blue hedgehog games people seem to like talking about, so in the meantime, I'll say what I always do. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.